The lecture which we are going to have today is about the adoption on UN Declaration and Convention on Women's Rights. The Global Treaty on the Rights of Women, officially known as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, is a pragmatic international agreement addressing the rights of women and girls. CEDAW strengthens the United Nations as a global leader inter alia global platform in standing up for women and girls. In countries that have ratified CEDAW, women have partnered with their governments to improve the status of women and girls. And as a result, they have also changed laws and policies to create greater safety and opportunity for women and their families. CEDAW can make a difference for women and girls, specifically to reduce sex trafficking and domestic violence, provide access to education and vocational training, ensure the right to vote, and forced marriage and child marriage, help mothers and families by providing access to maternal health care, and to ensure the right to work and own a business without discrimination. Such global treaty was adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 18, 1979. So far, 186 nations have ratified CEDAW. Equality of rights for women is a basic principle of the United Nations. The preamble to the Charter of the United Nations sets as one of its central goals for the reaffirmation of faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of man and women. The International Bill of Human Rights, combined with related human rights treaties, thus lays down a comprehensive set of rights to which all persons, including women, are entitled to enjoy without discrimination. However, the fact remains that such safeguards of women have proved insufficient to guarantee them the enjoyment of their internationally agreed rights. Since its establishment, the Commission on the Status of Women, that is CSW, has sought to define and elaborate the general guarantees of non-discrimination in these instruments from a gender perspective. In 1946, a sub-commission of the Commission on Human Rights was set up, but it was later granted the status of full commission as a result of the pressure exerted by women's activists. The mandate of the CSW included the preparation of recommendations relating to urgent problems requiring immediate attention in the field of women's rights, with the object of implementing the principle that men and women should have equal rights, and the development of proposals to give effect to such recommendations. Between 1949 and 1959, the Commission elaborated the Convention on the Political Rights of Women, adopted by the General Assembly on 20th December 1952. The Convention on the Nationality of Married Women, adopted by the Assembly on 29th January 1957, the Convention on the Consent to Marriage, Minimum Age for Marriage and Registration of Marriages, adopted on 7th November 1962, and the Recommendation on the Consent to Marriage, Minimum Age for Marriage and Registration of Marriages, adopted on 1st November 1965. Each of these treaties aim to protect and promote the rights of women in areas in which the Commission considered such rights to be particularly vulnerable. But it was believed that except in those areas, women's rights were found to be protected and promoted by other global human rights treaties. Although global instruments are found to be reflected, the growing effort of the UN system with regard to the protection and promotion of women's rights, the approaches so far made in this regard have not been fully realized, and they have failed to deal with discrimination against women in a comprehensive way. As such, there was concern issue for the UN to find out a comprehensive means to deal with such issues. Thus, the General Assembly on 5th December 1963 adopted its Resolution 1921, in which it requested the Economic and Social Council to invite the CSW to prepare a draft declaration that would combine in a single instrument that could provide a global standard articulating the equal rights of men and women. This process was supported throughout by women activists within and outside the UN system. Drafting of the declaration by a committee selected from within the CSW began in 1965, and the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was ultimately adopted by the General Assembly on 7th November 1967. Although the declaration amounted only to a statement of moral and political intent, without the contractual force of a treaty, it was found very much significant in some areas. However, Article 6 concerning equality in marriage and the family and Article 10 relating to employment proved to be particularly controversial, as did the question of whether the declaration should call for the abolition of the customs and laws perpetuating discrimination or for their modification or change. During 1960s saw the emergence in many parts of the world of a new consciousness of the patterns of discrimination against women and a rise in the number of organizations committed to combating the effect of such discrimination. The adverse impact of those development policies on women have become apparent. In 1972, 5 years after the adoption of the declaration and 4 years after the introduction of a voluntary reporting system on the implementation of the declaration by the Economic and Social Commission, the CSW considered the possibility of preparing a binding treaty that would give normative force to the provisions of the declaration and decided to request the UN Secretary General to call upon UN member states to transmit their views on such a proposal. The following year, a working group was appointed to consider the elaboration of such a convention. In 1974, at its 25th session, and in the light of the report of this working group, the Commission decided, in principle, to prepare a single, comprehensive and internationally binding instrument to eliminate discrimination against women. This instrument was to be prepared without prejudice to any future recommendations that might be made by the United Nations or its specialized agencies with respect to the preparation of legal instruments to eliminate discrimination in specific fields. The text of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women was prepared by working groups within the Commission during 1976 and extensive deliberation by a working group of the Third Committee of the General Assembly from 1977 to 1979. Drafting work within the Commission was encouraged by the World Plan of Action for the implementation of the objectives of the International Women's Year, adopted by the World Conference of the International Women's Year held in Mexico City in 1975, which called for adoption of a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women with effective procedures for its implementation. The said work was also encouraged by the General Assembly, which had urged the Commission on the Status of Women to finish its work by 1976 so that the convention would be completed in time for the 1980 Copenhagen Mid-Decade Review Conference, that is World Conference on the United Nations Decade for Women, Equality, Development and Peace. Although suggestions were made to delay completion of the text for another year, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women was adopted by the General Assembly in 1979 by votes of 130 to none, with 10 abstentions. At the special ceremony that took place at the Copenhagen Conference on 17 July 1980, 64 states signed the convention and 2 states submitted their instruments of ratification. On 3rd September 1981, 30 days after the 20th member state had ratified it, the convention entered into force, thereby creating and bringing out a clear climax of United Nations efforts to codify comprehensively international legal standards for protection and promotion of women's rights at the global level. CEDAW is composed of a preamble and 30 articles. In the preamble, it acknowledges that extensive discrimination against women continues to exist and emphasizes that such discrimination violates the principles of equality of rights and respect for human dignity. This treaty is aimed at the elimination of discrimination against women for the purposes of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms on a basis of equality with men. In Article 1, Discrimination is defined as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which impairs the enjoyment by women of human rights and fundamental freedoms in political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. Unintentional as well as intentional discrimination is prohibited. Private as well as public actions are regulated. Other areas are also covered. Exploitation of prostitution is prohibited in Article 6. Article 7 establishes women's right to vote and to hold public office on a basis of equality with men. Article 9 gives women equal rights in conferring their own nationality on their children. The importance of education is underlined in Article 10 with details measures to be taken in the area of education. Article 11 prohibits employment discrimination on grounds of sex, and it addresses employment issues relating to pregnancy and maternity. The particular problems of rural women and rights specific to their advancement are outlined in Article 14. Article 15 provides for the equity of women before the law in all civil matters, requiring states to give women equal rights to administer property. Finally, under Article 16, state parties are required to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in all matters relating to marriage and family relations. The remainder of the 30 articles of the Convention are concerned with the enforcement mechanisms and details of ratification, accession, designated depository, and arbitration of disputes between states parties concerning implementation of the Convention. In addition, the optional protocol to CEDAW has also been adopted by the UN. Now, to conclude, as we enter into the 21st century, the reality of violations against women's rights and oppression still remain harsh. Many developed and developing nations have constantly violated women's rights both at the domestic and international level. Parallel to this, an international tolerance of discrimination against women has been persistent. Many nations are able to turn a blind eye to such violations by successfully putting forward the sovereignty argument, which effectively excludes criticisms from outside. An international common effort is called for to introduce positive changes advancing women's rights. The CEDAW and its optional protocol are merely a soft international law relying on political pressure rather than legal force, and we still have a long way to go to change the deeply rooted attitude in our male-dominated society and to achieve actual equality with men. The progress is slow but certain. We need global solidarity and support for our local struggles, which involve not only national endeavors but also international efforts.